Hello, I'm Nelson McDaniel. I'm a parishioner at Christ Church in New Bern, and the church is doing a series or a project on beloved community through the year, and of course on the community that so many of us love and are grateful to live in. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the African American history in this area. It is a great interest of mine, and I have to quickly say that it's an interest of mine primarily because many of our very best stories come from the ones that we group under the aegis of African American history, even though I don't believe there is any such thing as African American history. There's history. And the reason today that we talk about African American history is that for a long time, many people neglected telling these stories. And so in many ways, we talk about African American history because we know that the complete historical record and the complete story was much truncated, and which made it made it necessary to go back then and pull out some of the African American stories. And at that point, many people can say, well, now the whole story makes sense, because it is one story. It is one story, but the role of African Americans wasn't forgotten. It was intentionally destroyed in many cases because it didn't fit the narrative that we wanted, particularly during the times of Jim Crow. And so many of the stories that are important in our history simply didn't fit the narrative that people in Jim Crow wanted to believe. Hopefully we're beyond that time now, although we know we still struggle with it and we're still playing catch up. Many years ago, when I first moved back to New Bern, and I was born and grew up in this town, and when I first moved back here, one of the people that I really wanted to spend a little time with was up in Durham. And he was a man named John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin was a distinguished scholar, African American himself, not originally from North Carolina, although he married a woman from North Carolina, from eastern North Carolina, from our area. But John Hope Franklin taught at a number of places, most notably perhaps in the latter part of his life, for the last few decades of his life. He was an important professor at Duke University. In fact, one whole part of the library at Duke University is named for John Hope Franklin. Some people have said that John Hope Franklin was the W.E.B. Du Bois of the second half of the 20th century. He was a legendary figure. Well, I very much wanted to meet him, and I didn't know that I would have the opportunity, but through some friends at Duke, I was able to meet him and spend time with him on several occasions. In fact, he faithfully promised me that he would be here in New Bern for New Bern's 300th anniversary in 2010, which I had the honor of chairing. But unfortunately, that spring, in his 90s, he died. And so he did not make it here for our 300th, but he knew this community well. He knew this community exceptionally well. I was sitting in his living room in Durham one day, and he looked at me and he said, New Bern, Craven and Carteret counties, and Beaufort have the most interesting African American stories in the nation. There's not another place like it. He said, never stop telling those stories. I've been haunted by that ever since. Never stop telling those stories, because coming from John Hope Franklin, that meant so very, very much. Franklin's first work, and perhaps his best known, in fact, it was a landmark work, was The Free Negro in North Carolina from 1790 to 1860. The Free Negro in North Carolina. His wife was descended from a free black family. And of course, as you learn about the free blacks in North Carolina, you're learning about the entire community, the white community, the enslaved black community, the community at large. But this was a landmark work when Franklin wrote this over half a century ago. In fact, interestingly, as he was doing research for this book, and he was using the state archives in Raleigh, he was involved in what may have been one of the first cases of reverse discrimination. It didn't really come to a legal issue because it got stopped before that. But Franklin, as a Black man, even though he had his doctorate, he was a great scholar, but as a Black man, he was not allowed to use the reading room of the state archives. He was not prohibited from using the archives itself, but he could not use the reading room. And the traditional way at the archives for scholars was to go to the reading room and request books, which would be brought to them for use only in the reading room. So the issue was, if Franklin couldn't use the reading room, how could he access these books and these texts in the archives? So he was granted permission to have a carrel in the stacks so that he would not be integrating the reading room. Well, of course, eventually many of the white scholars protested that Franklin was given preferential treatment by being allowed direct access to these books and texts. And the upshot of it was that he was no longer allowed to use the stacks, but he was allowed to use the reading room. One of those strange, and I can tell you so many stories about John Hope Franklin and about his life. I'm sure many of you know of him. He wrote quite a number of books, but that one was landmark because it established an interest in the free Black community. So when he told me that, I said, what do you mean? He said, because the story is so complex. In your area, you had an extraordinarily important free Black community, extraordinarily important, from very early on. We have Black families in New Bern who have no enslavement in their ancestry. They have been here since the beginning with no enslavement in their ancestry. So a very important free Black community. And certainly by the early 19th century, it was one of the most important free Black communities anywhere in the South. People were extraordinarily prominent in the community, successful and prominent people. We also had an enslaved community, but the enslaved community in this area was diverse. Of course, for many of us, the image of slavery is people working out in cotton fields. And we had agricultural slaves, but we also had a large number of artisan slaves. These were highly skilled people. We also had maritime slaves because we were a maritime community, and the waterways of eastern North Carolina and even beyond were so important to our commerce. And so we had maritime slaves. Now, one of the things that's interesting about artisans who were enslaved and sailors who are enslaved is that the level of skill that is developed is such that there is an imposed meritocracy. If you're out at sea on a ship in a storm, you don't ask the legal status of the person who has the skills to save your ship and your life. So that in those particular fields, and of course the same with the artisan skills, if the best brick masons are African American, and even if they are enslaved, you don't ask their legal status before you ask them to do the work. And so the fact that we had a wide range of both enslaved and free Black people in this community and in this area meant that our stories were already interesting. And this will be important, and we'll talk about this later. This will be important as we approach the Civil War and as things play out in the period during and after the Civil War, the fact that we had this strong free Black community, this remarkable free Black community, as well as enslaved community. Now, one of the things that surprises people sometimes is that some of the prominent free Blacks were slave owners. Remember, if these people were prominent and well off financially, then often the temptations were great. In fact, the most important slave owner in terms of the number of slaves owned in the history of this entire area, of all of this part of eastern North Carolina, was a man who was born enslaved, gained his freedom. His father was white, his mother was African. She was an Igbo, which means she would have come from an area that now is part of Nigeria primarily. And because his mother was enslaved, he was born enslaved, even though his father was a prominent white man, a parishioner at Christ Church, John Wright Stanley. John Wright Stanley had a white son, Wright Stanley Jr. He also had a black son, John Carruthers Stanley. And John Carruthers Stanley was his acknowledged black son. But he was born enslaved because slavery followed the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. But when he gained his freedom, he became a barber, a skilled profession. And he eventually owned several barber shops in this area, and he made a lot of money. And with that money, he began to invest. And he invested in, among other things, eventually plantations. John Carruthers Stanley owned 3 plantations and probably over 200 slaves, even though he himself had been born enslaved. His wife had been born enslaved. White's mother was born enslaved. In fact, he bought his mother-in-law out of slavery. The interesting thing for us, though, is to contemplate that the institution of slavery and the economic attractiveness of slavery was so powerful that even people who knew the horrors of it, from having been enslaved themselves, were seduced. Well, that's a story for a little later, the John Carruthers Stanley story, but because it tells us how complex this community was, it's an important part of the background. Many people don't realize that among the free Blacks in this area, there were soldiers who fought in the American Revolution. The little community of Harlow, which is on the border between what is today Craven County and Carteret County. If you take the back route to Beaufort, then you go through Harlow. And Harlow had a group of men known as the Harlem Patriots. Finally, just a few years ago, these men were recognized. After 2 centuries, these men who fought in the American Revolution were recognized. Now, these Harlem Patriots were free Blacks. They fought as soldiers in the American Revolution. Interestingly, if you look at the pattern of Blacks who fought in the Revolution, generally they have longer careers than the whites, usually by a factor of 3 or 4 times. They served more in the American Revolution than did most whites. Now, the Harlem Patriots, as they are called, the Harlem Patriots were particularly interesting for the length of service, but also because they came from such a small community. They came from a very small community. The head of the Sons of the American Revolution a few years ago, when we dedicated the plaque to the Harlem Patriots, said that on a percentage basis, the little village of Harlow furnished more soldiers to the American Revolution than any other community in America. Any other community in America. And yet, it's only recently that these soldiers were recognized. Thank God today they are. But some of the, if you know some of the Black families in New Bern, then you will recognize names like Godet. We've had so many distinguished Black families in New Bern from the Godet family, or the George family. Some of you may know Bernard George. These are families that served in the American Revolution as part of the Harlem Patriots. What an incredible story. So when we look at these things, we begin to understand the remarkable diversity of the stories within the Black community. It is not monolithic. Occasionally people will say, well, I know you're interested in Black history. Tell us about James City. Well, James City is a great story, and we'll talk about that later. But that is said almost as if that is the story. But we have so much early on. Now, I mentioned some of the Black artisans. And some of these Black artisans who were so prominent in the New Bern community have again never, at least in the last 100 years, had their stories told. They would have been well known in New Bern. Had you come to New Bern in the 1820s or the 1830s, these people were respected citizens who built fine homes, in many cases, whose children were being educated. It's not to suggest that there was not a hierarchical relationship. Race was always important. But many of these people, their stories are absolutely remarkable. A few years ago, Catherine Beischer, one of our great state historians, who's particularly distinguished in all that she's written about architecture in North Carolina. But Catherine became fascinated by the story of some of these artisans. And she wrote a book that is, to date, unique. There's not another book of this sort that has yet been written. And it's a book called Crafting Lives, Catherine Beischer, Crafting Lives. Little play on words there, because this is a book about African-American artisans in New Bern from 1760 to 1900. And these stories are absolutely fascinating. Donor Mumford, by the way, who was a great builder in this town, many of the fine houses and buildings that we admire so much in New Bern were built by Donor Mumford. And Donor Mumford, by the way, was a parishioner at Christ Episcopal Church. He was a Black man. He was a parishioner at Christ Episcopal Church. There's some evidence, we're not sure because many church records were lost. He may have been on the vestry at Christ Church. He was a Black man, a free Black man. By the way, he, like many free Blacks, employed enslaved Blacks to do some of the work. So many of the houses in New Bern, many of the fine old buildings in New Bern in the first part of the 19th century were built under Donor Mumford and by his artisans and his craftsmen, some of whom were free, some of whom were enslaved. We had tailors. I've already mentioned we had barbers. We had carpenters. We had builders. One of the interesting things about this book, when Catherine was writing it, she got a few of us together and said, now I want you to go through the book and critique. And what am I leaving out? And we noticed that all these artisans were men. And of course, if we were going to define artisan, as it, and by many people had been traditionally defined, and talk about brick masons and furniture makers and carpenters, then given the nature of the times, you're going to end up primarily with men. So she quickly expanded her definition of artisan to include crafts that were traditionally crafts more associated with women of that time, and tailoring and seamstressing and things that were would incorporate these people who were equally skilled as any other artisans, but by the traditional definition of artisan at that time, would have been left out. So if you're interested in this, I would strongly suggest that you think about reading John Hope Franklin's book on the Free Negro and Catherine's book, Crafting Lives. These are wonderful books that will give you some idea of the diversity of this community. So in the 18th century, the free Black community, the enslaved Black community, and of course the first enslaved people in this area were Native Americans. North Carolina settled later than South Carolina and Virginia. And so the African population came in later. North Carolina had smaller plantations by and large. Virginia had some huge plantations with thousands of slaves, the same in South Carolina. That was not the case in North Carolina. North Carolina settled differently, and it settled later. Of course, as we look at that peculiar institution of slavery, then we think about the people who owned slaves, but we have to think equally about the people who traded in slaves. So those of you who moved to New Bern and came from northern families, you don't get off the hook, not for a moment, because the slave trade was extraordinarily important, as you know, in northern ports like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore. It was extraordinarily important, and many a wealthy family and prominent family from those areas made much of their wealth off of human cargo. But of course, because of the nature of what the South produced, most significantly cotton, but other things, then of course slavery became an institution that eventually was most associated with the South and with even places like North Carolina. Now, we've mentioned what some of these people did, the artisans, the mariners, as well as, of course, the agricultural slaves. They knew the waterways. They were also fishermen. And many of those crafts and trades came all the way up into the 20th century. Even when I was a young man in New Bern, the finest brick masons in all of this area, and in fact, some of the finest brick masons on the East Coast of North Carolina were African American, because that was the trade that had been taught generation by generation. It's highly skilled. If you've ever tried to do brick masonry and think you know how to do it, then you learned a quick lesson. That is as skilled as surgery to do it well. And we had some of the finest brick masons in, up until relatively recently, some of the finest brick masons in all of America were from this area. If you look into the late 18th century and the early 20th century, then, as you see some of these families that began to develop wealth and prominence, just in the way that some of the white families were developing wealth and prominence, then you think, what happened? What happened that changed things? Well, in the 1820s and 30s, we began to see a conservative movement, and it was fueled, or fuel was poured on that fire by the Nat Turner Rebellion and by the fear of slave rebellions. And in the 1820s and 30s, things began to get much worse for both enslaved Blacks in this area and for free Blacks in this area. Banking laws were changed. Voting laws were changed. Now, why would it make a difference that voting laws were changed? Many people don't know that until 1835, Blacks in North Carolina could vote. Blacks in North Carolina could vote. Now, you had to be male. You had to own property. You had to be free. So the number of Blacks could vote was relatively small. But nonetheless, there was not a color bar in the North Carolina Constitution. The first North Carolina Constitution had no color bar. The second one, the Constitution that was ratified in North Carolina in 1835, added a color bar. And blacks, including those prominent free blacks, were disenfranchised. And concurrent with that, many of the banking laws were changed. And it became much harder for black families to accumulate and keep wealth and to own property. So things got worse. We tend to have a view of history as linear, that things get a little better and there's a little movement more and more towards justice, but it can go backwards. And it certainly went backwards from the 1830s until the eve of the Civil War. Things became more difficult for many of the black families in this area, both enslaved blacks and free blacks. So what did life sometimes look like? Well, we try to go to people who wrote about it at that time, and many people wrote about it at the time. We have a pretty extensive record, but one of my favorite books is a book that came out just a few years ago called Recollections of My Slavery Days. And this book is the autobiography of William Henry Singleton. William Henry Singleton. Now, this autobiography had been lost for all practical purposes, because, and we'll talk about this later, because the narrative of these stories did not fit in well with Jim Crow. I mean, if you're going to be a white supremacist, you can't talk about successful blacks, because it flies in the face of everything white supremacists believe, which is an innate superiority of whites. And you cannot have people who did these remarkable things. So these stories were lost. But my cousin, David Soselsky, we're distant cousins, but I claim him because he's so dang smart that I want to claim him. David Soselsky was doing some research in the public library on Fifth Avenue in New York. And because he was a PhD candidate, he was able to use the stacks, and he found a copy, what was probably the only remaining copy of this slave autobiography, Recollections of My Slavery Days. And he picked it up and was looking through it and realized that Singleton had grown up just a few miles from where David had grown up, literally just a few miles. And then he began to realize that the family that had owned Singleton originally was part of David's family and my family. And he became fascinated by this book, and he and Ante-bellum decided that they wanted to take that book and edit it and annotate it. And the annotations are wonderful because, of course, slave biographies often change names to protect people. They often change the dates of events to protect people. And so they painstakingly went through this biography. And so it's one of our great treasures. It's one of the great slave biographies that exist today. So William Henry Singleton's life, what was life like for a man who was enslaved in eastern North Carolina in those days? And he was on a plantation. He was on the Nelson family plantation down near Garbacon Creek, which, for those of you who know the Neuse River, you go down the Neuse River, Garbacon Creek, Adams Creek is very well known because that's where the cut is. That's where the inland waterway goes through. But this plantation was on Garbacon Creek, on the lower Neuse River. And that's where William Henry Singleton was born. When he was a young boy, and this happened, horrible as it is to contemplate, this happened because he had promise, because he seemed to be strong. There was an interest in producing the best possible price that you could get for him. So he was sold to a slave farm in Georgia. And so he was taken from his mother and taken to this slave farm where the purpose was to try to grow him into such a specimen that he would bring a good price on the auction block. Singleton, at 8 years old, escaped from that slave farm in Georgia. And he, 8 years old, made his way back to Bacon Creek into his mother's house. And he tells in this autobiography, he tells that story. He tells that amazing story of how he got back. He hid in his mother's root cellar. Then eventually he was discovered by his master, and he was enslaved, but allowed to stay on that plantation where he worked until he escaped and came to New Bern and became a bellboy at the Gaston Hotel over on South Front Street. And he was here in New Bern when New Bern was occupied by the Union Army. Occupied, liberated, depending on your point of view. For him, it was a liberation, not an occupation. And through that, he eventually joined the African Brigade, which became the 35th U.S. Colored Troops. And he fought, as did many of the formerly enslaved people who had made their way to New Bern in that period. And that's another story. But he fought in those 35th U.S. Colored Troops. And he lived after the war. He lived an important life as an AME Zion preacher, and eventually was in Ohio. In fact, he died marching in a 4th of July parade, wearing his wool Union Army uniform. He was in his 90s, marching in a 4th of July parade in Ohio. These stories are epic. So again, if you want to know what life was like, and again, as with all slave biographies, you have to understand that they had to try to protect people. And so the annotations here are extraordinarily important because David Sosowski and Kat Mallon have helped us a lot to understand the context within which he was writing this. By the way, his grandson became a judge in North Carolina and a member of the state legislature. So remarkable, remarkable story. So we can look at stories like that, these individual stories, and begin to have an idea again of how complex African-American life, and therefore white life in this area was, because these communities were not separate communities. Particularly in the South and in an area like this, there was a good deal of intimacy. Again, it was hierarchical. I don't want to suggest or to have anybody think that I'm suggesting that things were good. It was hierarchical, but there was intimacy. People knew each other. And in many cases, they knew each other relatively well. And because you had all of these different stations, even within the enslaved community and within the FreeBlack community, you had people who lived in different neighborhoods around here. The Long Wharf neighborhood, one of our oldest Black neighborhoods, which is where Trent Court is today. Eventually, of course, the Dryboro neighborhood, which was a very important early 19th century neighborhood where people owned their own homes. Very important African-American neighborhood. Sadly, most of the material culture in that neighborhood was destroyed in the Great Fire of New Bern in 1922. But thanks to our wonderful friend Ethel Staton, the story of Dryboro is told again today, and indeed Dryboro is on the National Register of Historic Places. These were important communities in which free Blacks, enslaved Blacks lived, but also we need to remember that some of the fine houses in downtown New Bern, almost all of which is white today, in 2020, as we sit here in late March of 2020, the neighborhood that I live in of downtown New Bern is almost all white. Had we been here 200 years ago, that would not have been the case. Had we been here 50 years ago, that would not have been the case. We are more residentially segregated today in many ways than we were 50 years ago. Certainly more than we were 100 or 150 years ago. So for us to understand and to appreciate the community that was liberated, occupied in 1862, we have to understand this background. We have to understand the strong Black leadership that was already here. We have to understand that in spite of the hierarchical differences, those leaders often had a high degree of respect within the community. And they were integrated into institutions, particularly the church. Now, today, people often regret the fact that the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in all of America. And it's true, but it was not always true. Churches like First Presbyterian Church, one of our great old historic churches, Christ Episcopal Church, one of our great old historic churches, First Baptist Church, one of our great old historic churches, St. Paul's Catholic Church, what was the forerunner of Centenary Methodist Church, which was, of course, Andrews Chapel. These were integrated congregations until just before the Civil War. Now, one of the reasons they were integrated is that because Black congregations could not assemble. Again, the fear of slave revolts and the fear that there would be conspiracies against the existing order meant that assemblies, including churches, were illegal under the laws of North Carolina. And so you had no opportunity for Black churches. So in the late 1850s, as those laws changed, and then particularly during and just after the Civil War, there was a great enthusiasm for and a great excitement about having Black congregations. Whether that was pleasing to the whites in congregations as well as to Blacks in the congregations, it's very hard. Again, a lot of research is being done, needs to be done about that period. What we know is that in part the congregations were integrated because there was not a choice. So that's very important in our story at Christ Church as well, to know that. You know, and occasionally I'll hear people they'll look at the balcony at Christ Church and say, and that's where the slaves sat, up in the balcony. Of course, that balcony did not exist. As you know, the interior of Christ Church dates from the 1874 restoration of Christ Church, and after the fire. And so it's a little bit amusing, but also a little bit annoying to hear people give that kind of evidence. But you do hear some of the strangest things. Now, what about the relationships between the white and Black community? And did whites understand? I mean, surely there were people who understood the great evils of slavery during this period, particularly they had in front of them Black people who were such amazing leaders and people who were so entrepreneurial and so skilled. Surely that called into question the injustice of the system. And people knew that. It's not that people were ignorant. It's not that people were ignorant. It's that slavery as a financial institution was incredibly seductive. incredibly seductive. So seductive, as we said, that it even seduced many wealthy Black people who bought and owned slaves. So that for us to understand some of the people who saw the evils of it early on, both Black and white people, is important because they played a role in informing our conscience at that time. And I venture to say that in some ways, many of the people in the 1820s and 1830s were more aware of the moral ambiguity than people were in this community in 1900, when the white supremacists had been pretty successful in convincing people that Blacks were innately inferior. Now, who are some of the people that we need to read in order to understand those relationships during that period? The first one I always would point to is William Gaston. William Gaston, who, in my judgment, was the most important person in North Carolina history. William Gaston was born here in New Bern. He was born to a father who was a surgeon, Scots-Irish surgeon who had come to New Bern. His father was a patriot. His father fought against the British. His father was Protestant. His mother, who was of English descent, had come here from England, was profoundly and deeply Catholic. And William Gaston was born to these folks shortly before the Revolution and lived on Lower Craven Street. During the Revolution, his father was a patriot. And when the British soldiers came into New Bern and his father tried to escape by rowing across the Trent River, his father was shot in the boat as he tried to make his escape. In fact, the story goes that with young William at her side, his mother stood begging for her husband's life, and the British officer lowered his musket onto her shoulder to steady the musket and shot and killed her husband. Well, then William was raised Catholic, but there were very few Catholics anywhere in North Carolina. So when he was a little older, his mother decided to send him to Philadelphia to Catholic schools. William went to Philadelphia. He met many of the people in Philadelphia, and remember, New Bern at that time had a strong relationship with places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York. As you walked through all the streets in those towns in those days, people would have known New Bern. I venture to say that if you were in Baltimore or New York today, and you said you were from New Bern, that the majority of people would not know where you were talking about. But that would not have been the case then. So it was not unusual that he would go to Philadelphia for school. And then eventually, he and his mother learned about a little school that was being formed in a small town on the banks of the Potomac River, a little town called Georgetown, which of course today is part of Washington, D.C. But Jesuits were forming a little school, and he went down to that school, and William Gaston was the first student at Georgetown University. When I went to graduate school at Georgetown, I was quite proud of the fact that one of the buildings on the old quad is Gaston Hall. Well, Gaston went to Georgetown until he became ill, came back to New Bern, went back to New Bern Academy, where he had been schooled, and then decided that he wanted to continue his studies by going to the College of New Jersey, which was in Princeton, New Jersey. Today, of course, we call that Princeton University. It was a Presbyterian school, and his mother was petrified that if he went there, that he would be converted to Presbyterianism. Well, Gaston went there. Not only did he not convert to Presbyterianism, but he formed a society which converted many Princetonians to Catholicism. And that society still exists today. And I have two good friends who entered Princeton, Charlie Scribner from New York and Ray Keck from Texas. They entered Princeton as perfectly good Episcopalians and left as Catholics because of the society that William Gaston had formed to convert Princetonians to Catholicism. Now, why is this important if we're talking about Black history? Because Gaston knew what it was to be a minority. When he returned to North Carolina and began to study law. And by the way, one of his professors from Georgetown moved to New Bern in order to tutor him in the law, both French law, because Xavier Martin was a Frenchman. So he taught Gaston both French law and English law, and then went south to become a Supreme Court justice. But Gaston studied that law and became an attorney here in New Bern. But the North Carolina State Constitution, that same early Constitution, which had no color bar, had a religious bar. And as a practicing Catholic, he could not hold office in North Carolina. Now, interestingly, what the law said was that in order to hold office, you had to swear an oath saying that you accepted the truths of the Protestant faith. Gaston's brother-in-law convinced him that he could swear an oath that he believed in the truths of the Protestant faith without ever abandoning his Catholic faith, because the Protestant faith and the Catholic faith were essentially the same thing. That's pretty remarkable when you consider that these people were having these discussions shortly after 1800. So Gaston ended up being in the North Carolina Senate and House, and then he ran for the U.S. House. He was a member of the U.S. House during the War of 1812, was friends with people like Daniel Webster, bitter enemies with John C. Calhoun, great friends with John Marshall, who, as we know, became perhaps the most formative figure in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court. Gaston returned, though, after his time in Congress, he returned to New Bern and to North Carolina because he thought that's where his role was. And as such, eventually he was appointed to the North Carolina Supreme Court. John Marshall had wanted him to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Gaston was such an intellect, had such a keen legal mind, but it was the North Carolina Supreme Court that appeared to William Gaston. 1834, there was a case that came before the North Carolina Supreme Court. The case of North Carolina versus Will. North Carolina versus Will. Will was an enslaved man who had killed his overseer and been convicted of murder. His case was appealed. Now remember, he was enslaved, and we're talking about the 1830s. His case was appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and his defense was paid for by his owners, who sided with him over the overseer. Case went before the North Carolina Supreme Court, and the North Carolina Supreme Court, in an opinion written by William Gaston, acquitted Will of murder. And they acquitted him on self-defense. And in that opinion, in that majority opinion, which Gaston wrote, he wrote that while Will was in the unfortunate condition of servitude, that's the word he used, unfortunate condition of servitude, because while Gaston was opposed to slavery, he accepted the legality of it. So while Will was in the unfortunate condition of servitude and therefore had no civil rights, he nonetheless had human rights like any other person. Amazing. That distinction between civil rights and human rights. This is 1834. We knew better. We knew better. Our great minds knew better. But again, economic seduction, the economic seduction of slavery, the fact that the whole commercial and economic fabric of the South depended on it. And for a great while, much of the economic success of the North depended on the trade, this human trade even though we knew better. It was irresistible. But we did know better, and people like Gaston told us. Gaston made several commencement addresses at Princeton in which he predicted that if the issue of slavery were not settled, a great civil war would engulf our nation. Sadly, the last male descendants, direct descendants of Gaston, to bear the Gaston name, were killed fighting for the Confederacy. But we have his name around, Lake Gaston, Gastonia, Gaston County, et cetera, a whole generation of Black people who named their children Gaston, and white people, because this man was so admired. He was Catholic, he was Federalist, and he was anti-slavery. He never should have been elected to any office in North Carolina, and he was the most admired statesman of the 19th century in our state. We knew better. Things were more complex than we want to believe they were. And that's what makes it scary. That's what makes it scary. Because as the Civil War approached, and in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was the foundation for things to become good. Reginald Hildebrand, scholar in the African American Studies program at Chapel Hill, said in the aftermath of the Civil War in Newbern, North Carolina, like nowhere else in the nation, we saw what could have been. We knew what was right, but there was too much advantage. There was too much advantage in continuing to live the lie, which eventually became the second enslavement that we call Jim Crow. And make no mistake about it, it was a second enslavement. But that's a story for the next time. It's been fun to be with you. Is that okay?
Terrific.
I don't even know how long that was.
I don't know.
Can you see how long it was? You asked me to shoot for an hour, so I should have been